Empower360 Podcast. And here at Empower360, we give enlightenment to humanity and purpose to humanity. So my name is Lilifa. I'll be your host, and our guest today is Hafiz Subanwahi Muhammad. Sorry if I didn't really mention the name well, but I hope I got it. So while we're here this afternoon, we're gonna talk a quick. We are going to look at something about World War I and World War II. About some two wonderful heroes. I don't know what Hafiz has for us today. So Hafiz, you're welcome, and you can go ahead. Thank you. Yeah.
We cannot evict the fact that history has a lot to do with our present and eventually our future, wherever we find ourselves. And to talk about history, you can never mention history without bringing up a history that affected everyone in the world. And in this case, about a world war, right? So we are supposed to discuss like the stories of two World War heroes, two veterans in two world wars. That's the World War One and World War Two, in the perspective of the eventualities that shaped their history or their title of being heroes in the history of the world. So basically, I mean, one may ask for a briefing about World War or how do you call it, who we call, or when do we say we have a World War. So basically, there are there is this unsettlement between the big powers of the world. It doesn't necessarily have to enclose the whole world, right? When there is
Yeah.
this upset between like the big powers of the world that eventually affects every country in the world or the world in general. I mean, we are tempted to call it a world war. And per history, we've had two of those instances where everyone or all of the big powers have been massively involved in, artillery battles and battles that have shaped the world we are living in right now. And eventually, when we discuss world wars, we are definitely going to mention about casualties, right? So, in these events, like there are human casualties, there are economic casualties, and then there are property casualties. And at the end of the day, it's all centered around economics. The world breaks down whenever there is war, there is a fall, there is how do you call it? There is the need for the world to catch up back in terms of progress for where it has reached before distractions. So, in the case of this world, we've had two wars that have happened and been called World War. The first is the Great War, which was called World War One, and it basically involved, just as we discussed earlier, the big powers of the world. So around the time where France had won itself from Germany, the German powers, there were tensions in the world.
Mm.
In late 18s, like there were tensions in the world. Around the same period, Bosnia had been annexed by, how do you call it? That's Austro-Hungary. That's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was having the big time support of Wilhelm and his people in Germany. So, I mean, there is that little trigger. That's why we've titled this our program as Luck and Misfortune, right? So, in the eventualities, in the occurrences of the world, there has always been the little margins. There has always been little things that have shaped whatever happened. And surprisingly, if we had missed out on these very basic, the very nitty-gritties of it, if we had missed out on these very little things, probably we would have been talking about different stories. There might probably be no World War One if Gaviloria Principe never attacked the life of Archduke Ferdinand, right?
Yeah.
The Austro-Hungarian, the heir to Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Ferdinand. So he was supposed to attend a program, and then in how do you call it? There was this kid from a group. It was actually a secret agent that was backed by Serbia. It was around that time that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had annexed Bosnia. So it was against the interest of Serbia, who felt like the Bosnian people were their colleagues as Slavic countries or the Slavia group, right? So there was Gavilario Princip, who was part of the secret service called the Black Hand. And the kid was an under 20 kid. So just imagine the whole world has risen to that point where there is extreme tension and everyone is killing each other, one another, and everything, just because a kid who wasn't even 28 had attacked the life of someone. So it was discovered that the attack that he did against the life of Archduke Ferdinand, which for the first time he missed. That's when they threw this thing. How do you call it? They threw one of their artilleries to the car of Archduke Ferdinand. They were trying to attack him, and for the first time they missed out. And just imagine, the kid had missed out. And the popular story is that when he missed out on the life of this thing, Archduke Ferdinand, when they threw the missile at him, right? They threw how do you call it? The bomb at him. They missed out, and then there was just the rush to get how do you call it? The few people who were injured around that part to the hospitals. Driver and his boss, that's the Archduke and his wife, had just left out of the scene, right? Because their life was in danger. And then, in respect to that, the Duke, who was supposed to leave the scene, right, decided out of his own discretion, decided that he wanted to go back to check on the casualties, the people who fell casualties to whatever happened in the hospital. So when that happened, funny enough, the driver who was supposed to drive this that we are talking about, Archduke Ferdinand, to the hospital, actually took a wrong turn. So it was just a wrong turn that got this person in a vicinity where this Gavilario Princip, who was already aiming at attacking this man, he was ready just to claim the man's life, that's the Duke's life, just crossed him again. He had actually missed out on his mission. He had missed out on his mission, and he was seated at a coffee shop to get a coffee because it was very, very frustrating at that point. There were tensions around the vicinity. And funny enough, when his driver, that's the Duke's driver, took a wrong turn, it was just at the point where this guy was taking his coffee, according to the most popular history. So, I mean, before we go further, it's worth establishing that for accounts of history, we always have variations of stories. You get it. But then, as far as I'm concerned, it is just our own research and our own capacity that gets us to stories that we sit on currently. Whatever be the case, as far as we learn, we keep knowing, we keep getting different viewpoints, right? But for now, there's the story that I think is well sold at this point. So then got them just in front of the kid who was holding his gun. And just at that point, he saw them. And it was an open talk car because it was just like for the optics because he was attending a program. So, yeah. So this guy just saw them and then he just opened fire and straight into the Duke and his wife. That's Archduke Ferdinand. So it became there were rising tensions in Bosnia, and then in Austria-Hungary, they were very tense because their air has been murdered, and it's a big time. How do you call it? It's a story making thing because right now you are testing their powers because you've tested someone. You've actually taken the life of someone who is within the power spectacles, and then in reverse the medal was traced back to the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a secret armed force which was backed by the Serbian government at that point. There were a lot of tensions, and around that time, Germany had given Austro-Hungary their word. They had given them the word that whoever tries them, they would back them. And around late 18s, a similar issue had happened where Wilhelm backed. But then in this case, in trying to prove that he would stand for them no matter what, he had this, how do you call it? He had this upfront conversation with them, that's with the powers that be in Austria-Hungary, that whatever happens, Germany would support Austria-Hungary. So the division of powers was Austro-Hungary and Germany, and then there was how do you call it? There was Italy, who was also backing Germany. So the formations were coming up. Formations were coming up around that same time. France had established a relationship with how do you call it? England, which was like there was no going between them. They were solely committed to each other. And then, in retrospect, we had Russia, who was also supporting France and Germany. So the point now is that a lot of tensions had happened in the late 19th century. And here we are headed to the 20th century. We are actually in the, how do you call it, the early days of 20th century. And then we have someone who has threatened an ally, right?
Yeah.
So when you threaten an ally and Germany is ready to give in all his support no matter what, you can trust that if Germany attacks or if Germany counters, it will trigger the interest of other allies and it would escalate. Exactly what happened. So when Germany backed and Austro-Hungary started to persist on taking revenge for the murder of their heir, it became a soft spot for how do you call it, Serbia, who had also mobilized the support of Russia, who was an ally to France, who was being threatened by Germany. And then France was also an ally to United Kingdom, which is England. So there was that formation of the Brits, the French, and the how do you call it, Russians. And then there was on the other side the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and then how do you call it, the Italians. So basically, this is just, I mean, a microcosm of what luck or misfortune or whatever an occurrence is, which could have been missed out. This is just a microcosm of how it can shape the world. So in that case, we have just this little thing that happened, which was, I mean, just a wrong turn with the driver. Look at how surprising it is. And then we have a
Yeah.
world war. The world is going into a war.
Wow.
So in our context, we are going to discuss like two war veterans. The war veterans that we are going to discuss are a certain Henry Ganta and then Hiro Onada. So we
Yes.
have,
So have sorry, before we delve into the two veterans, like I mean the
yeah,
heroes, I would want to ask a question where I mean people keep saying there are times when people say, "Oh, the history is about to repeat itself." In that context, meaning that the past is about to repeat itself in the future or in the present. But I personally sometimes think that the past only guides us into the future and not necessarily history repeating itself. I mean, when it comes to IR and I mean, in the world of war, this is a common statement whereby people says, "Oh, the past doesn't really guide us into the future, but the past no, sorry, the past rather guides us into the future." But people also say, "No, no, 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 no. The past always repeats itself, or history always find a way to repeat itself." So, in this context, what do you think about it?
I mean, in the context of the past and the present, I think the best arsenal we would have against the history repeating itself is to at least know history.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we know history, just as you established, it would always be a guide to us. But then the how do you call it? The situationalities of history are such that there would always be that point where even when you know, interests come to play,
Yeah.
right? So we can just take the current happenings in Israel and Gaza, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is not the first time we've
Mm-hmm.
seen we've seen how do you call it, the post Balfour Declaration 1947. Like we've
Mm-hmm.
seen a lot of things happening between Gaza and how do you call it, Israel. But then why does it keep repeating? Because the interests are still persistent. Like nothing changes if interest doesn't change. So if
Mm-hmm.
my is to annex you, or if my interest is to get you off the map, or if my interest is to just invade you, whatever be the case of we knowing or not knowing history, at some point in time, if my interest line is triggered, I'll just go get my interest. And then eventually, whatever comes out of it just becomes the consequential requisites, the consequential benefits of whatever we are doing, or the repercussions of whatever it is at that point. So I think one, we must know history.
Mm-hmm.
Two, we must have a genuine interest, which collectively isn't possible.
Yes.
So all we can do for ourselves, like personally, is to understand history to the extent that we are not always being fooled, right? When the masses are being how do you call it, deceived
Mm-hmm.
in understanding what is not, at least for us who are fairly aware and not
Mm-hmm.
oblivious, we can just have a fair ride with what is happening and probably refer it to history or guide our movements towards the future. So I think with
Yes, that's wonderful. Just to add to what you said, it's like I keep asking people that what you know to be true. Is it that you have read or you've had a conviction that is actually true, or you were being told is true? Because in to me, a compromised truth is still a lie. And like you rightly said, sometimes in conflict, we just look at the tip of the iceberg. You cannot just look at the trigger, or you cannot just look at the current happenings and just conclude that, oh, is this, and stop pointing fingers. Because in conflict, I know there are shadow parties. I know the people actually tell you maybe we need this, we need that, but hey, like you said, probably that's just not the interest. So it's like an onion. You have to keep peeling, 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 peeling to get to the main interest of the people. And
yeah,
till you target that main interest of the people, they can tell you, oh, we need this, we need that, but that's not what actually they need. So I mean, to resolve some of these issues, you have to find out what really is the interest, who are even at the actual parties, because sometimes it looks like as though these are the parties, but in hindsight we know that that is not the parties. Like people are just the shadow parties who are actually the ones at the war front, but they hide behind others to, I mean, champion their interest, like you said. So wonderful.
yeah. I mean, the whole concept about truth is just, I mean, as dicey as it is, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, I read this. How do you call it? One of the philosophy writers of Dr. Jordan Peterson, and he was
Mm-hmm.
even trying to define what is correct. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do we call an answer when a question is asked? And then in his categorization, he gave like, I mean, three categorizations which effectively challenged, I mean, our perspectives. Is it true because that is what has been written to be true? Is it
Mm-hmm.
true because that is our perception of the truth?
Truth.
Or is it just true because we have accepted it as the truth? So, I mean, the philosophy of the truth is a whole ball game on its own. So I
Mm-hmm.
think fair enough, whenever something comes to us, we can understand that it might either be the truth because there are so many forces trying to make it the truth, or it's
Yeah.
actually basically the truth. So no matter how learned we are, we become vulnerable because we are not, how do you call it, omnipresent, right? We are
Mm-hmm.
not at any point where some occurrences do happen, right?
Yeah.
Even academic documentations are infiltrated with interest. So how
Yeah.
much more what is not academic and just stories that are solely propagandas and everything. So I think it's fair to know that whatever we are doing, we are just trying at any point in time. Whatever we know is just susceptible to being either truth or not.
Not.
So fair enough.
Yeah. Thank you. So you can continue to the second part.
Yeah. So I think our conversation got to where I was supposed to mention
The
the
two
two
veterans. Yeah, the two heroes.
that we talk about. So in the first case, I mean, we can just for the first episode of this podcast, we can just briefly hit on them because it's still a research in progress. But then the discoveries, I mean, are still intact for now because just as we
Yeah.
established, everything we are doing is just like every information that we have is just
We
like
are trying.
that is as yeah, we are
Yeah.
certain time we are very vulnerable with the information that we have. So in the first case, we have a certain Henry Gunter.
Mm.
Henry Gunter was an American war veteran. He was
Mm-hmm.
actually from, how do you call it? He was from pre-World War Germany, right? So he
Okay.
was from Germany and he had moved to Portland. And I think during the recruitment process of war, how do you call it? Of the war, the
Mm.
First World, he was deployed as a member of the delegation in France.
Mm-hmm.
So among the regiments that went to France, there was Heriganta.
Mm.
And Heriganta was kind of this guy who had possibly positioned himself to be selected into this how do you call it this regiment.
Yeah.
So when he was selected, when Henry Ganta was selected, there were a lot of accusations because around that time people really hated Germany. Nazi hated so bad. So there was this how do you call it stigmatization against people from Germany. So Henry Ganta wasn't any different. Not even from home, even during like his recruitment process. That's when he was deployed for the war. That's World War One among
Yeah.
the American soldiers. Henry was still having a challenge of identity. His own colleagues were identifying him sometimes as the bad seed because he was from Germany. So it was just like the inherent stigmatization that came with being a German. So Henry had a mission to prove himself so bad. And then again, there was this point that happened where it was leaked that Henry had been writing telegrams. He had been writing letters back to his friends in the United States that if they hadn't been recruited yet for the war, they shouldn't. And he was citing the dire instances in the war. He was citing the how do you call it? The ugliness of what was happening in the war and in the process. And for some reason, his superior chanced at one of his letters that he had written back home. And for a military personnel, that is like, I mean, that is as obnoxious as it comes because you
Yeah.
are going to lose your credentials.
Mm-hmm.
If officially you are not being, how do you call it? If officially you are not sent back, you still have that stigmata already that you, this particular person, are not given in, or there is that red knot on you that you might be a sellout or you are not fully committed. So Henry had this crisis that he was facing, among others. And in the process, I mean, for someone who genuinely had good intentions of serving and fighting Nazi Germany, at this point for him, it was just so much to carry. So he had to prove himself beyond reasonable doubt that he was committed,
Yeah.
right? And it was actually pre-World War One Germany. So it was kind of like him battling his identity, him battling against the crisis that he's facing against his identity, and then him having to prove that he's not actually a bad seed, right? So we got to the point where World War One was supposed to end. Henry had had his fair share of the criticisms. He had had his fair share of being a victim of all the stigmata. So it got to a point. I mean, the very final part of the World War. That's on the 11th of the 11th month. That's 11th of November.
November.
We always see the 11th hour. That's the very last point. So that was when armistice was announced. 11th of November 1990, right? So on that day, the night before that day, the Axis countries, I mean the super countries had come into agreement that the war was ending. Germany had had an agreement with Britain and the rest that the war was in its final stages and it was time to just balance all the costs and end the war because enough had happened. The whole lots of human casualties, the economic backdrop that they were going to face in the next few years had already been projected. So everyone was trying to accept the reality that it was time. So in the case of that, the agreement had been signed in the early hours of that 11th November, right? But then it was stated that the war should end at 11 o'clock. So 11 o'clock of the 11th of the 11th month, 1919, was slated that the war should end. They had signed agreements. Everything was in process, right? So for some of the, how do you call it? For some of the military personnel who had been deployed, around the regions of France and Belgium, they had the information that the war was ending. And even within the regiments, the United States regiments that was around the Pierre Lamont where it happened, they had also had the information that the war was ending. But during the final days, Henry Gunter, who was so much battling with identity crisis and was forcing to prove himself to the people that he was just the guy, he was genuinely pursuing. You get it? He was trying to do, find for himself a hero's mark. And in that course, Henry was trying to prove himself. So we got to the very final hour. That was around 10:59. With just seconds for World War to end. We are talking about seconds for a war that had started from 1914. And it was seconds away from ending. The world is coming back to peace.
Yeah.
Henry Gunter decided to go a full of show against the German, artillery. And when Henry was approaching, the German artillery had set up itself around one side. And when Henry was approaching, his colleagues were calling Henry back because it was a no-go area. And Henry was trying to prove that he was going to attack them in the very final minutes. And eventually, it ended with Henry being fired by the artillery. And the casualty was that hard. So it was extremely fatal. Henry died at the very last minute. When we say last minute, in all literacy, this is last minute. Because war was ending at 11 o'clock. At 10:59, Henry Gunter was killed. And he is believed to have been the last man to die in the World War I. So for him, it was so much of misfortune. And for everyone who was around Henry, it was after this action of Henry, this statement action of Henry, that everyone was trying to reassess the whole Henry situation, kind of give him the benefit that the guy actually was a good deal.
Yeah.
So for him, the whole concept of war and peace was in between the very aspect of war and the very aspect of peace. That was the very final minute. And Henry Gunter was a sorry story in the very last minute of the war. And to that matter, we call it a misfortune.
Yeah.
So that is our first war hero. I mean,
wonderful.
There are a lot of writings around Henry Gunter, and just as I tell you, like there are academic contexts that have argued, just like every hero story that we have. For every hero story that we have, there is actually a very genuine group who were victims to that person's how do I even put it? That person's how do you call it? Achievements, right? His heroship.
Yeah.
There is a group that were victims to his heroship. And to these people would be villains. They would never be heroes.
Heroes, yes.
For every war story that we have, for every heroic story that we have, there is a sad part of it. There is an academic context of it that argues is the benefit that we are giving that hero. And it is different with Henry Gunter. There are actually academic contexts that dispute the legitimacy of what Henry Gunter did. And as him being a hero or not, there are arguments for and against the context. Sure. So that's our first hero.
Okay. You can move on to the second hero. Then after that, I will ask a bit of a question. Then we can take it from there. Thank you.
The first hero we are talking about is Henry Gunter, and he was marked for World War I. There is the second hero. And for the second hero, it was a story of misery. It was a story of misinformation. A story of pursuit. A never give up story. And a story which never looked like it was ending.
Wonderful.
This second hero was Hero Onoda. So Hero Onoda was a veteran in the Japanese military
Mm.
who had been deployed, as a youth to a certain island in Philippines.
Mm.
So when the World War was at its peak, that's the Second World War was at its peak,
Mm-hmm.
Hero and his group, which he was the leader, had been deployed to an island in Philippines.
Mm.
He had fought severely during the World War, endured with his team, and I think it was a very small team. And then at every instance, he was losing a member of his team
Mm-hmm.
until it was just him on the team. So Hiro Onada is actually that guy who has the weirdest World War story.
Mm.
Because after the war ended in 1947, Hiro Onada never knew the war had ended. So this guy's story was a story of someone who fought 30 years after the World War had ended.
Ended. Wow.
So for 30 years after the World War had ended, this guy was in battle. And attempts had been made by superiors. Like they dropped leaflets in war areas, deployment areas,
Mm-hmm.
leaflets to inform deployments that war had ended. But for him, every one of those leaflets was assumed as a trick from the enemy.
Whoa.
So it took his superior to fly after years of knowing and hearing that there is still a Japanese military man on this particular island who is still fighting. It took years and years. And in the 30th year, it took his own military superior from government to fly to the island to go and tell Hiro Onoda that the war had ended.
Wow.
And for 30 years, the element of luck is that for 30 years, the many battles, the hunger, the confiscations that came with being on an island for
Yes.
30 years and still surviving. It took many elements of luck because every other person that was deployed with Hiro Onoda had died.
Wow.
Except the challenges, according to his own story of meeting the wild animals, the challenges of just meeting random people who would end up fighting with him, was those elements that added up to him surviving.
Wow.
To have encountered several instances of near-death moments and then coming up again, surviving after 80 years. Forgetting the years that were deployed during the official war years.
Yes.
So he had actually served for many years. So in the case of Hiro Onoda, there is that luck, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in his case again, there is an element of misfortune
Mm-hmm.
because he had wasted over 30 years of his life
Yes.
at a no, how do I even call that zone? It's just at a 0 point.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was coming.
Mm.
So 30 years of his life was wasted there.
Yes.
While every other person's life had moved on.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Hiro Onoda, there is that point where they say them. It's actually a famous how do I call it? British war statement. That's when the British soldiers had come back from war. And the records with veterans of war is that after war, post-war, most of them come back academically off their grades, psychologically not there.
Yes.
The rigor, how violent, lecherous the war could be to them.
Them.
For them,
Yes.
come back out of like their shape. You get it? So it would famously be recalled when one of the British writers said about the war veterans that those who came were never the same again.
It's true.
And to back that, they said, them who have gone are the lucky ones.
Yeah.
Those who died are the lucky ones because those who came back were not even human anymore.
Yes.
So for someone to spend this number of years, the psychological cost of that can never be overstated.
No, not at all.
Exactly. So that is the misfortunate part of the story of Hero and all that. But then the lucky part of his story has always got to do with how he survived for 30 years on that island and came back to Japan, and the merits that he got from being that war hero. So in the context of luck and misfortune, these are the two heroes I put together and just briefly had something to say about.
Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, these are very two interesting heroes, and I'm just intrigued by the second hero story because for you to still be fighting, but I mean, he has the spirit of a military man because,
Yeah,
like he said, receiving the letters still can mean that your opponent or your enemy is the one trying to cook up stories for you to believe that it is over so that he can defeat you. So, and I think even relating it into human context, if we can train our mind not to just accept anything as it is, like it could go a long way to affect you. I mean,
yeah,
it's not gonna be a smooth journey, but you just don't
sure.
accept things because, oh, I've seen it. Like, you have to find out for yourself. And I think that was a great move. Although, like you said, you wasted a lot of 30 years is more than a decade. So, but in the long run, there is, to every story, I believe there is the negative and the positive. So, in as
Exactly.
much as possible that it was negative for him to spend 30 years of his life, looking at the positive side, I mean, it's powerful,
Yeah,
honestly.
I mean, a man will be remembered forever.
Yes, because even I'm like, whoa, like this is so true because it could have been true that your enemy is the one trying to trick you to believe that, and it
Exactly,
happens. Like in modern days, it happens. Like
exactly.
even scam and fraud actions. That's like it's in this way because sometimes you think, oh, maybe it's true, but by the time you know, somebody has screwed you up. So wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, in the two contexts, we have one whose story was mostly defined by misfortune. That is
Mm,
Ganta. In the case of Henry Ganta, it was mostly misfortune. I mean, the fortunate aspect of it all, which is the lucky aspect of it all, is at the end of the day, he was accepted as a
yeah,
hero of the state's military, right?
that's
So,
true.
him for him, the element of luck is, I mean, the how do you call it, the marginal one, and the element of misfortune is the greater one. And then in the case of Hero Onoda, we feel that the element of luck is the greater one, and then the element of misfortune, despite being, I mean, very huge, it's
Mm,
huge, but then for him, we feel that the element of misfortune was the marginal one, and then the element of luck was the bigger one, because what is it beyond life? And he came back as a lively man.
that's very true. Yeah. So thank you so much, Hafiz. I think it was a one. I mean, we've really learned a lot. I personally have learned a lot. And thank you, audience, for making time with us. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, and share. So we'll meet again next week. Have a lovely day. Have bye.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miss Lily. It was super exciting.
Yeah, I really appreciate it and I really enjoyed every bit of it. Thank you.
All right. Yo. All right. All right. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
All right.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Am I off?